Thanks so much to everyone for joining us here this afternoon. If this is your first time to our beautiful new offices, welcome. We hope to see you again for more interesting conversations. It's an honor to welcome all of you and our distinguished panelists for this afternoon's event. I'm Jennifer Bradley. I'm the founding director of the Center for Urban Innovation here at the Aspen Institute. Since its founding in 2015, the Center for Urban Innovation has harnessed the innovative power of cities to make them great places for all of their residents, especially those in underserved neighborhoods, to live, work, connect, and flourish. The common thread in all our work is steering innovative products, practices, and processes towards greater inclusion and equity. We use the tools that the Aspen Institute has honed over the last half century to advance our goals. We frame problems and opportunities. We create and tell new stories about cities, innovation, and inclusion. We convene practitioners within and across cities. And we elevate positive examples of inclusive innovation and process change through blog interviews, case studies, and panel discussions like the one today. We are grateful to have an opportunity to hear about positive examples of innovation and change from a distinguished group of speakers. When Mayor Steve Goldsmith and his co-author Neil Kleiman sent me a preview copy of their new book, A New City OS, The Power of Open, Distributed, and Collaborative Governance, I read it not just as a person who works on urban innovation and government innovation, but also as someone who has lived in the district for 24 years and has seen enormous changes take place in city government, city wealth, and city outlook over that time. And so the question that I had when I read the book was, how can all residents take advantage of this new, more effective, open, and distributed and collaborative governance model that Steve has championed? And since I run a center, I get to host events to answer my questions. We'll have opening remarks from Deputy Mayor Courtney Snowden, and then a panel discussion and some Q&A at the end. And after that, you're all invited to stay for a brief reception. We'll start off with Deputy Mayor for Greater Economic Opportunity, Courtney Snowden. Her bio is incredibly impressive, and I think most of you have it, and I'll just hit some of the highlights here. Deputy Mayor Snowden is that rare creature, a sixth-generation Washingtonian. How long ago? How long ago does that go back? A long time.
Great grandmother sold Fort Stevens to Lincoln.
Well, okay then. Wow. That's kind of cool. Deputy Mayor Snowden focuses on workforce and small business ecosystem in the district, and she has extensive experience in political strategy and lobbying. She lives in Ward 7 with her two sons. So, Deputy Mayor Snowden.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It is such an honor to be at the Aspen Institute. I'll tell you a little secret about me. I don't usually use microphones because I get nervous when I hold them and my hand shakes, and your swag can be messed up when that happens. So, as you heard, I'm Courtney Snowden, Deputy Mayor for Greater Economic Opportunity, and the first of its kind in the District of Columbia and the first in the entire country. The mayor, like many of us, how many people have been in DC 10 years? 20 years? 30 years? Any natives? Yes, that doesn't happen often in these rooms. There are a number of us natives who've seen the city change significantly, and certainly you longtime residents have as well. We have seen prosperity sweep through the city in ways that we would have never imagined, right? Have you been to a Black church? Do you know about call and response? Work with me, people. We never expected to see it, right? We never expected to see the 8th Street that we see today or the rejuvenated U Street that we see. Who would have ever thought that there would be a Turning Natural or a natural juice bar and vegan restaurant on MLK in Ward 8? Did you think that was going to happen? No, you didn't think it was going to happen. Here's what we know, though. As we've seen buildings grow up and prosperity expand across this city like you would have never guessed, we've also seen communities become even further removed from that prosperity. The mayor saw that on the campaign trail and decided to take what we believe was a particularly innovative step to create a deputy mayor level position focused on ensuring that we were expanding economic opportunity to district residents no matter where they live, but in particular in overlooked and underserved communities. And so my colleague who you'll hear from, Deputy Mayor Kenner, does a lot of work, and we work very closely together. While he builds buildings and other things and jobs, I build people. And so I am focused on making sure that we are growing small businesses along overlooked and underserved corridors, and that we are improving what was the absolute worst workforce system in the country. That's not a joke. We were 56 of 50, seriously. 56 of 50, and now we're number one. So we're incredibly proud of that great progress. We've done that through some really important and critical innovations. One, like the Aspire to Entrepreneurship program, which is a program focused on helping returning citizens start their own businesses. Now you can imagine that some of our returning citizens have some business acumen, if you know what I mean. And so we've helped them to turn that biggest business acumen into legitimate businesses. In just 4 cohorts, we've started more than 13 businesses, each of which together they've created 39 new working district residents. Applaud that. They created opportunities for district residents who were just like them, many of whom are also returning citizens. We partnered with companies like Uber to help expand their footprint into Ward 7 in a community that has gone overlooked and underserved for far too long. And so now Uber will open up 8,200 square feet on Minnesota Avenue and hire 25 new people right from the community. We didn't put $1 of government funds in that project, but what's really exciting is they made sure to hire all DC-based businesses to build it out. We know that that activity on that corridor will help improve the quality of businesses along that corridor and importantly create more jobs for district residents. We have seen unemployment decrease by leaps and bounds across our city. We're down to 5.8%, but we've seen the most significant decreases. We've driven down unemployment most significantly in wards 7 and 8. That's a big deal because we've done it by actually putting people to work and not just moving new people in. And so we are actually, in fact, in Ward 7 at the lowest recorded levels in the history of the city. Here's what's amazing about this. All of this only happened because there was a senior level person specifically focused on figuring out how we grow and build overlooked and underserved communities, or do what I call help people gentrify in place. How do we ensure economic development happens with us in our communities and not to us? And we have some really great partners across the government. You're going to hear from my colleague Brian Kenner, but we also are focused on education. We're also focused on health and human services and public safety and making sure that we're building the types of communities where people can feel safe and flourish, but importantly, where they will get to stay. 2 more initiatives that I'd like to talk about. We launched something called Financially Fit DC. If you haven't done so, go to financiallyfitdc.gov. This is a website that allows people to create financial fitness plans. And what we've learned over time is that everyone needs that, not just our low-income residents. In fact, I have a number of friends who summer in the vineyard and go to Paris and have 2 Range Rovers, but couldn't give me $20 if I needed it. Right? And so what we've really focused on with this project is helping people really identify and achieve their financial fitness goals, but most importantly, really helping them to purchase homes. So you're going to hear, I bet, a bit about affordable housing on this panel. But what we know for sure is as we get people connected to meaningful job opportunities and get them into the right opportunity that will allow them to sustain themselves in the district, if we're not connecting them to the right set of affordable housing and purchasing, they can't stay here and sustain themselves in the District of Columbia. And so we're very focused on that. And then finally, we're really focused on how we grow and expand workforce opportunities for district residents. So we do that through the Summer Youth Employment Program, which we've expanded to 20 to 24-year-olds. I'll tell you, some of our friends on the council don't think that was a good idea. So if you agree that Summer Youth Employment Programs are good, please call them and let them know. And we've done it by creating some innovative partnerships like the DC Infrastructure Academy, which is a partnership between district government and all of the utilities and WMATA that will help train district residents for good paying jobs. The average wage is about $50 an hour. Can you believe that? $50 an hour. And we know that if we get DC residents into those low barrier opportunities, they will be able to sustain themselves in what is becoming an increasingly expensive city. The mayor has been incredibly clear about the necessity to really meaningfully focus on overlooked and underserved communities, and doing so through employment and small businesses. We've been able to turn corridors around with a partnership across government, and what I know for sure is that as long as we can continue to do it, we can continue to keep longtime district residents here in the city, raising their families, owning homes, starting businesses, and contributing and benefiting from the prosperity that has swept through our city. So I'm honored to stay for a little bit of the panel. I know you're going to hear from, again, my colleague and some colleagues that we heard from recently. And I hope you will join us in this work. Follow us on Twitter at DimGeoSnowden so that you can check out our work and tell everyone all about it. Thank you so much.
I'd like to invite the panelists to come up and join me. We have Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, Brian Kenner. He focuses on major real estate development products like the District Wharf, on developing the city's inclusive economic development strategy, and on preserving affordable housing. We have Scott Kratz, the director of the 11th Street Bridge Project, which will connect Capitol Hill with communities east of the river in a way that emphasizes equity and community voice. And we have Mayor Steve Goldsmith, who is a professor at Harvard, a former mayor of Indianapolis, and former deputy mayor of New York City. So, Mayor Goldsmith, one of the things that struck me in Deputy Mayor Snowden's litany of all of the things that the city is doing is that, as you note in the beginning of your book, this is not something that city government was necessarily organized to do in its original incarnation in the progressive era. So can you talk to us a little bit about your book and what you've discovered about how city governments can be more effective even as they are taking on entirely new and increasingly urgent tasks? And Elena, do you want to get the slide?
Well, they could buy my book.
All right.
It's a place to start.
everything
You asked a question. I have a slide. They don't quite match. Let's just do it this way. I thought the deputy mayor's opening was important in a number of ways, right? So we have prosperity in cities and we have issues in cities, right? We have lots of folks moving to cities. So what I've suggested in the book is the following. I'll do this really quickly. One is that we have tools today to make our public employees smarter than they were before, right? And your question suggests, we've set up this system of government where, in order to protect us against corruption, we've limited the discretion of public employees, right? So the way we've made it so that they can't abuse their discretion is we've eliminated their discretion. They all work in little rules and little boxes, and so it makes it difficult for bad folks to be good in public, but it makes it really difficult for good folks to be good, right? So we push people to the center. So we now have digital tools. We can make workers in the field smarter. We can see what's really happening in neighborhoods in real time. We can analyze in a digital way all of those trends that are happening. We can predict outcomes before they occur, right? And so just one way to think about your question is that instead of acting in a routine fashion, government can identify outliers, right? It can predict gentrification. It can predict abandoned homes, right? It can match jobs with the talents of individuals and kind of what's missing to get that individual into that job. So we have a lot smarter tools today than we've ever had before. And then the other issue really is that we can listen in ways we never listened before. I know it's different in the district, but my history of community meetings is that they're not always a perfect way for communication and transparency, right? So we now have tools that allow us not only to have in-person meetings, but if you're really intentional in reaching out to communities, particularly those who are underserved, there's ways to listen to them with social media, texting, and the like. So big changes in how we think about platform government, big changes in how we think about the tools that a public employee will have in order to solve problems of people who are underserved.
Great. So Deputy Mayor Kenner, how is the district using some of these new tools? Can you connect like a process change with a different outcome in the city? You got smarter internally by doing X, and residents saw Y.
One of the things that we decided to do, and this is about 3.5 years ago, and it was really under the sort of the mayor's sort of idea, plan, was affordable housing. And if I go back 20 years in the District of Columbia, I did see some hands for people who are 20-year or 30-year residents of the District of Columbia. I came to Washington at first in 1996. And so I remember lots of things about Washington in 1996. I remember first time my car got broken into, which was right over by Shakespeare Theater in Penn Quarter. And if people know Penn Quarter today, you wouldn't think that your car would get broken into at 2 o'clock on a Saturday, right? Generally. But my car got broken into 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday in 1996 because that was sort of that neighborhood at that time still. Traditionally, I think as cities, as Steve said, people are moving into cities. And I think one of the outcomes of that over the last 20 years or so is that the traditional issues of urban locations, which have really been public safety and education, not generally, so I won't generalize, but I'll speak in Washington specifically, but I think you can see this in other larger cities, is getting better. You're finding people sending their kids more often than not when they come to a city school. You are finding generally in every city sort of has this, many cities I've worked at, they have this survey that they give their residents every couple of years that asks them, do you feel safer in your neighborhood? And I think generally, again, in Washington, you're seeing that score increase. You're seeing people feeling safer in their neighborhood and in different parts of Washington, D.C. So the interesting part for me is that I think we're at a place where it's not perfect, and that's not saying that crime and education issues aren't still relevant in Washington, D.C., but what I think it has done is it's made livability that much more of a pressing issue for people. If anybody has voted in the District of Columbia in the last couple of years, you will see a party, literally a party, as in like a Democrat, Republican, or whatever, called "The Rent is Too Damn High." Has anybody seen that on their ballot, right?
Yeah.
It's a funny moniker, right? But it's kind of a catchy saying. And the interesting part that I also find is that the rent is too damn high no matter how much money you make in the District of Columbia. If you make 6 figures in the District of Columbia, you may not be able to live in the neighborhood that you want to live in. Is that a true statement? Yes. If you make 30% of the area median income, which is about $30,000 or $40,000 a year, you may not be able to live in the neighborhood that you want to live in. And so that concept, that livability, no matter where you are on that area median income or how much money you make, spectrum is becoming much more important to everybody's life, not just people who traditionally have been categorized as poor, but working class and even upper class people aren't able to live sometimes in Washington, D.C. and in many major cities, necessarily in the neighborhood that they want to live at because the rent is too damn high. So one of the things that we tried to do, going back 3.5 years ago, is make a requirement, the steepest requirement at that time, that if you're going to do a city development project, that 30% of your total units needed to be affordable. And how do we define affordability? We define affordability for those units as being 50% of those units need to be at 50% of area median income, and 50% of those units need to be no higher than 30% of area median income. And so those are relatively steep affordability numbers. To put that into the income, HUD normally defines the area median income as a family of 4. So a family of 4, and the area median income for the Washington region, I haven't seen it recently, but it used to be somewhere around $111,000, $112,000 a year. I'm going to round for a second and just say 100. And so if you're making 30% of the area median income, that means a family of 4 is making somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 a year. And the same thing for 50% of area median income. It means you're making $50,000 to $60,000 a year for a family of 4. And so this requirement that we have, has yielded literally hundreds of additional affordable housing units that, had we just been living under the existing inclusionary zoning requirement, which says that private development in the city, you've got to build somewhere between 10 and 15% of your total units need to be affordable, and that affordability used to be at levels of 80% or 60% of area median income. This requirement that we have on city projects is a tangible sort of inflection point and result process change that we made 3.5 years ago, sort of based on this issue that we know that we're trying to make investments around education and healthcare and public safety, and we need to start treating housing literally as almost like an infrastructure or an issue that we need to be making policy statements specifically around.
Great. So, Mayor Goldsmith, how would this notion of a distributed, open, collaborative governance system respond to challenges like housing affordability and gentrification? How can you either have what you've seen, or how can you imagine that this new form of governance that you talk about in your book would support these challenges of cities being a lot more successful than they might have anticipated?
Well, we have a number of pretty complex issues you've just raised in the last couple questions. And yeah, And to some extent, right, that to a large extent, Brian's dealing with large macro issues and trying to use public policy to ameliorate the problems that success creates. And so that doesn't have an easy solution.
Right.
So, but attempting to kind of connect your question and the book to Brian's note, it might look something like as follows. Well visualized open data tells us a lot about communities, right? When Mayor Garcetti visualized in a geographic way all of the public data in LA, immediately you could tell that the sanitation conditions in certain neighborhoods from public works were not the same as in other neighborhoods, right? It allowed in Chicago advocacy groups or nonprofit organizations to manipulate the data to demonstrate activities that were occurring in their community, right? It allows organizations to be advocates for fairness in the way police treat their residents by kind of looking at circumstances by the ethnicity of the person who's arrested or stopped in a location, right? So one way to think about this is if we're thinking about distributed platforms, either through individuals themselves or through maybe their proxies, right? Community-based organizations, ANCs or whatever, you have people who are a lot smarter in advocating in their own best interest. Another way to think about it is the way Brian said, which is we're going to identify and predict these trends more effectively with the data that will tell us what's going to happen in that community. And then you can also then say, oh, well, wait a minute, there's other aspects as well. Louisville and Chicago and other places have now air sensors, right? And how do we connect the health of a community with the air quality in the community in a very discrete way? So a lot of the stuff that we accepted as we just accept it as the conditions in poor neighborhoods no longer needs to be accepted. The tools are there to identify that and then build on that as well. So those are just different ways to think about the answer to your question.
Sure. So Scott, not only are you situated physically between Deputy Mayor Kenner and Mayor Goldsmith, but I think that the work that you're doing with 11th Street Bridge literally connects some of the things around new ways of listening, around improving low-income neighborhoods in place, while thinking a lot about issues of affordability. So tell us a little bit about how you see the 11th Street Bridge project as kind of literally the bridge between these two, the new ways of resident engagement and these giant questions about who is a city for?
Yeah, so first of all, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So for those that don't know, the really quick sort of overview, we are partnered with the city. I work for a nonprofit based east of the river, based in Congress Heights, called Appropriately Enough, Building Bridges Across the River. We run a 203,000 square foot the facility located in Congress Heights that has 14 nonprofits that exist in sort of one building. And we're partnering with the city, with DDOT, the District Department of Transportation, to transform an old freeway bridge that it has aged out and reusing some of that infrastructure to build a new park that can physically and metaphorically bridge communities. I think when we started, I'll answer the question in two different ways. I think when we started back in 2011, 2012, before we got any architects involved, engineers, landscape architects, anybody else, we needed to go out and talk to the community and not say what colors should the deck chairs be, right? But actually take several steps back and say, should we do this, right? Was this viable? Does the community even want this? And we had over 200 meetings in those first 2 years with faith leaders, with ANC commissioners, with business leaders, with youth. We worked with young men and women who are participating in the city's summer youth employment program that Courtney mentioned, and paired them up with architects and landscape architects to design what the park should be. That was our model for putting in front of designers. But having that, I think the reason why I'm overemphasizing that is that particularly when we're working in communities of need, there is an enormous and justifiable trust deficit, right? People have come in those communities and for a variety of reasons have made a lot of promises, and some of those promises haven't been kept, right? So I think it's about building trust, and that trust is about shared experiences over time, right? And that trust is extraordinarily fragile. But when we were out there talking to the community, they recognized that this was a big, ambitious task, but they also said, well, let's were excited about this, and we said, all right, well then help us shape it. Help us drive every single programming element that's the part of the park that then was incorporated as part of a design competition. And the community actually was embedded as part of the design competition, where the community got to vote, and I didn't vote, right, on the final design. The community did, right, which was great. But the second part, so I think one, that sort of constant building in a constant community feedback loop is critical. But the second thing is, I think when we were out there in the community listening to ideas of what kind of programming should be on this park, we heard a lot of great ideas for a performance space, environmental education center, cafe, restaurant, access to the river. But we also heard a much greater need. We heard a need for housing, right? We heard a need for workforce development. We heard a need for wealth creation, right? So soon after we announced the design team, we started working with members of the Office of Planning with the district. This has been a public-private partnership from the beginning, with senior scholars from the Urban Institute, LISC DC, DC Fiscal Policy Institute, to take a look at a discrete 1 mile area around the park and think, how can the Bridge Park act as a larger convener to think about answering the very simple question, but very complicated answer of how do you invest in places of need without displacing the same residents you're trying to serve, right? I think we in DC have seen an enormous amount of growth, right? What, 1,100 people a month have been moving in, over 100,000 residents they have been moving in the last 12 years. It's enormous. How do we ensure that that prosperity, that we're thinking intentionally, we're thinking about it through a community-driven the sort of effort, and we're thinking about this really early, right? To set some of these policy in place and some of these strategic actions. And the last thing I'll say is what came out of this larger community-driven process was an equitable development plan that has strategies in housing, workforce development, small business enterprises, and we've since gone back and added in cultural equity strategies and political equity strategies to ensure that the thousands of people who've helped shape this park to begin with can be the ones that benefit from it.
I'm going to stick with this theme of trust. As some of you may know, the Aspen Institute prides itself on values-based discussion, and we like to connect these giant, humanistic concepts like trust with the wonky day-to-day of policy. So, Brian, how does this notion of trust between government and residents play out in your work, and what do you do at DEMPED to kind of shore up some of the trust deficits that Scott has talked about? And then I'll come to you, Mayor Goldsmith, to talk about kind of trust and accountability and transparency.
I'm going to answer that in two different ways. One is that, for us, trust is the basis upon which we are able to be taken seriously, to be believed, and for people to understand what our intent is. And so the only way that I know how to do that is to try as much as possible to say what it is that we are going to do and what we can promise to do. I cannot fix every single ailment that's out there. I won't be able to ameliorate every condition or issue. I can't guarantee that every single person is going to have a job. I can't guarantee that every single person is going to have access to the housing that suits them. I cannot necessarily guarantee that every small business that is created or has an idea is going to be successful in the District of Columbia. What I can promise you to do is I can talk about why we're trying to do the things that we're doing and what we hope the intent of it is. How many people we are going to be focused on making sure to get jobs. How many affordable housing units we are going to be creating for this community. So as much as possible, it's about trying to just be honest with what it is that we can do, and trying to make sure that people understand at least the intent for what our actions are. The second part of your question, though, is my best way to answer that is that it's complicated. If you think that I go to a community meeting, as I often do, and let's just say that I go to a community meeting at Congress Heights, which I did about 2 months ago. Does anybody believe that I get one overriding comment only? If I go, as an example, if I go to Congress Heights today, or if I go to historic Anacostia, which is actually more interesting, and I say affordable housing, the answer is what? What do people tell me? Corruption? Okay, maybe not that one as much, but I appreciate that. Rent is too damn high, so they need it, right? They want it. Would that be a fair answer to your? That is not the predominant thing, especially in historic Anacostia, that I get. They say, I already have it. I already have all this affordable housing. Like, why? I want market housing. Where's my grocery store, by the way? Like, west of the river, I see all this stuff. I don't see it in my community, so like, where is that? How come you guys aren't talking about market rate housing? That's what I want in my community. So like, I get it. There is no overriding community voice that guides us simply. And I know that Scott has heard that in his hundreds of community meetings, which is that there's different people, there's different perspectives about everything. And so, this trust issue is about trying to be honest about what you can provide, because you're not going to make everybody happy. Like there is no, whether that's east of the river or west of the river, there's no, I've 1 out of 400 community meetings I've been to, done, where there's just one voice that overrides, where you can say, aha, I got it. I know exactly what they want. Typically, and especially in these emerging neighborhoods where they're simultaneously wanting and fearing things at the same time, you find this great tension. And I think that is, frankly, I think that's sort of the economic development challenge of every amenity-rich city today, is that you find this tension in how sort of government builds trust, but also executes on a vision that in the long term is going to be best for those residents. That is sort of the du jour issue today.
And are there tools that you are using now that help you at least communicate, at least help you tell the story that you want to tell? Because that's so I'm feeding you a lot of questions because I know that you have to leave us in about 4 minutes. So I want to maximize your talking time.
We're, I think like most places, we're trying to take advantage of technology. We've got social media, surveys, we've got surveying sort of tools that we've used. To be frank about it, though, I think there's nothing like old-fashioned communications. The best communication tool that I have ever seen is someone's story. And that's not my story, but it's someone who's there, a resident, a worker, you name it. That is the person, that is the people, that's the feeling that you get. There's nothing that replaces the feeling of trying to communicate issues or trying to tell the intent of what you're trying to do, like a personal story. And so I still believe that is actually the most powerful tool.
Great. Mayor Goldsmith, your book talks a lot about transparency and accountability, and how, as you said in your opening remarks, we built all these systems to make sure that everybody followed the rules and nobody could cheat. And that's how we had trust in government starting in the progressive era. And now with new tools, we need to think differently about accountability and trust. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was telling Brian before we sat down, so just have to show my authenticity here. I was chairman of the Anacostia Redevelopment Commission pre-baseball. And we were spending $1 billion and had no one's trust, I think, right? Right. Even the beneficiaries, I don't think trusted us. So I appreciate the complexity of the problem. And I also know that Brian's got to get out. So let me bucket it this way. First of all, there's a difference between trust and everybody being happy with government, right? And and a lot of people don't want to have a really close personal relationship with their government, right? They want their problems solved. So I think about this in a couple different ways. Let's take it at the most minor level. Every day when a resident has an interaction with his or her government, we ought to start by making that as easy to do and responsive as possible, right? There's no reason why, well, there are plenty of reasons why your experience with Amazon is quite different than your experience with government generally, even though it's, of course, good and perfect in the district, but not everywhere, right? So let's think about how we can personalize your relationship with government. What do you need to know? How can what government has to offer make your life better, right? I've got a complaint. I need to get a driver's license. I want to know what time basketball court lights go off at night. I want to know X, right? And how can I make that as easy as possible, right? And outbound SMS messaging, how do we personalize that? How do we do that? So every day there's a set of those things. B, I've got a problem, right? How much transparency can I get into when will that problem be resolved? Brian's comment about expectations is tremendously important, right? People get frustrated when their expectations mismatch what's possible, right? So using the data to visualize those expectations. The issue about a narrative is really important as well, right? So the data, we can do story mapping, right? We can tell stories with data as well about what's happening in a community. So I think that so that's one way to think about trust, from little to big. Another way to think about trust is how do we visualize the data that allows folks in one community to understand life in another community, right? Because we have this polarization in society generally, and have economic polarization in all successful cities, and so it's important that we create a sense of place so that people can understand what needs to happen for others to benefit in the community. So I would just say that trust is wide-ranging. It starts with the mayor, frankly, when she says something, do people trust her? And then how does her government fulfill its responsibilities in a way that she has more trust, and that allows her then to articulate big, overarching solutions to problems because the folks trust her on a day-to-day basis. So I'd say it's kind of all in. The policies need to be right, they need to be inclusive, but folks need to kind of understand what their government's doing.
Great. Brian, before you go, anything you want to add or leave with our audience? I'm not kicking you out, but
I appreciate that.
I need to maintain a good working relationship with your staff.
I appreciate that. Not really. I just, this issue, and I think I see the hashtag Better City for Who. I firmly believe that this is going to be a bigger and bigger issue in cities every single year. I see Washington as being an example, but I think that if you go to Chicago, Boston, Austin, New York City, Denver, it doesn't matter. Places where people are moving to, which increasingly is cities, and that's not just young people, that is people of color, that's women, that's older people that are all moving to cities more and more, or closer to cities. I think this issue of how are cities changing and who benefits and how can we make sure that the most people benefit and how do we make sure the city is inclusive of as many people as possible is the issue that we're all going to be faced with increasingly in the future.
Great, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Brian, you brought up the issue, and you can leave while I'm talking about it.
I appreciate it.
You brought up the issue of this tension between what people want and what they fear. I think another tension that is happening in cities is the tension around time. So Mayor Goldsmith, in your book, you talk about needing to respond in real time. And yet, Scott, one of the things that's clear about the work around the 11th Street Bridge is needing to move, as my friend Lauren Ellen McCann says, at the speed of trust, which is not always lightning fast in communities where there's a trust deficit. So can you talk a little bit about how you're managing that people want to see change quickly, whether that's your government partners or your philanthropic funders, and yet if you move too fast, that can actually go against your larger goal?
Yeah, two things to that. The one is I think when you're, so I think timing is critical, right? And sequencing is critically important, right? I mean, in many other cities, an investment happens, and then it's, oh wait, what just happened? And we've had so much success, right? And at that point, once the market sort of finds a neighborhood, it's going to move so much faster than certainly a nonprofit, or I'd argue probably even the government that can move. It's just going to move. Capital's going to move that much faster. That's just the system we're in. So I think setting those strategies in place. I mean, in our case, setting it 5 years before the earliest we could open the park, I think is really important and really critical. I think, too, one of the things that we thought about as we were developing the strategies for the Equitable Development Plan there were strategies that were in there that are going to take a minute. Starting a community land trust, of which we are starting, is going to take a minute, right? I mean, it's separate private nonprofit you need to create. You need to create an advisory committee that turns into a board. You need to think about your bylaws and blah, 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 all that stuff, right? So we're doing all of that, but as we were creating these strategies, it was really critical to have some early wins that were in there, right? So in our case, we had an early win that we partnered with another amazing nonprofit, MANA, who's been serving the DC region for 20 plus years, who've been running a very successful homebuyers club at their headquarters in Ward 5. And we said, hey, can we partner with you and start your homebuyers club east of the river, right? And so the recommendations came out in December, and in January, we started a homebuyers club, right? In the last 2 years, that homebuyers club has seen over 200 residents, 200 Ward 8 residents. Now, over 60 of those Ward 8 renters are now property owners, right? So capturing some of that long-term wealth, right? Generational wealth. So I think thinking about having some early wins, thinking about some deliverables that you can point to. It's the sort of thinking incrementally, but that builds on that, I think, is critically important. And then the other thing I think is sort of making sure that we're all collectively accessible, right? I mean, I think Brian and his whole team, like we're out at every community meeting, and Brian's team, whether it's DDOT, whether it's Office of Planning, whether it's DHCD, are out there at these same meetings, right? We need to be present. We need to sort of be there so you have somebody that you can start building those relationships that you know who you can talk to. I mean, I knew that, one sort of short story, I knew we were making success when a resident in Fairlawn, which is just next to Anacostia, called and I got yelled at, right? And what I mean by that is somebody was putting up flyers in Fairlawn saying we were going to clean up the neighborhood, and somehow word got out that it was the 11th Street Bridge Park, and we had nothing to do with it. And still haven't figured out sort of who put those up. But the residents were ticked off, right? They were like, who is coming outside our neighborhood and saying that they have the right to come in and clean up their neighborhood? They were just justifiably upset, right? We never figured out who that was that were putting those flyers up, but they knew who to call, right? Because we had built sort of those relationships. And I think we, like all DEMPED staff and city staff, need to make sure that we're accessible. And because otherwise, the narratives get created, right? Whether those are true or not, narratives get created. And if we have that sort of access to whether it's sort of the nonprofit world that's out there or the city officials, that accessibility is key and can't be understated.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you. So, Mayor Goldsmith, what is one thing that you think, when you look at all the examples in your book, is there one thing that really stands out, or is there one example that you think people should that you'd like to see a lot more of, or is it kind of, are you advocating for process change as opposed to everybody should adopt an air monitoring system like Louisville?
Well, let's just take the last several questions and several answers and synthesize them in an answer to this question, right?
This is why you're the professor.
So yeah, I think I like mayor as a title better than professor, but or even deputy mayor, right? So government is set up vertically, but people live horizontally, right? They don't live in the Parks Department. They don't live in DDOT, right? They live in Anacostia, or they live at 10th and Main. And they see problems in the kind of the system, the ecosystem of their neighborhood. And government's set up this way. So the big breakthroughs come as we think about government as a platform that allows its agencies to work horizontally and allows those agencies to understand they work in a platform system where all knowledge isn't inside City Hall. Right, so they need to look peripherally in City Hall, and then they need to look out in the distributed system. They need to find ways to learn. They need to find ways to pose a question, take the data, iterate the policy, and then eventually act, to your last question. So the big thing for me is when and DC is doing a very good job today compared to other cities, right, is how we have, like the deputy mayor is in charge of equity. Who's in charge of looking across the agencies? How do the data guys, right, the policy labs in DC, with their very strong men and women who work there, how do they look at trends across, right? So and you could play this exercise any sort of way. Is the problem with homelessness in the homeless department, or is it in the drug therapy or mental health or domestic violence departments, right? I was at an event with the mayor and the CEO of Uber, right? And the question there was, what is it that keeps folks from getting transportation that would allow them to have a job where they don't have the transportation to a job today, right? So I'd say the one big thing is to set up platforms that allow government to be smarter in the way it listens and the way it acts and to respond more quickly.
Great.
Can I jump in and just
Absolutely.
the underline that this is absolutely critical. We think a lot about and there's a lot of talk about how do we think about cross-sector the work, but this is really, and this is not only critical, but it's also where the really fun stuff happens, right? If we're for instance looking at we're about to acquire, I think, knock on wood, our first community land trust property, right? A 65-unit apartment building in Congress Heights, super exciting. Each of those units are going to need to be renovated, right? So how do we make sure we're then aligning with our small business enterprises who are based locally that we've been building capacity for, so that those small businesses east of the river who are actually doing the renovation? And then how do we think to make sure that those CBEs, that those small businesses, are hiring locally and tapping into our workforce development piece, right? That's where you start to see true leverage. Like that's what you're talking on a citywide level, but that's where you're starting to see huge the shifts. And I think what's interesting is when we were developing the equitable development plan, that's what we heard from residents, was like, stop thinking about this through like the housing bucket and the workforce development bucket and the small business bucket or cultural bucket, whatever, because life doesn't work that way, right? I mean, our lives sort of intersect in these in sort of every single day.
That's why your job is important, right? Because you're in charge of a place, right? Sure. You're not in charge of an activity, you're in charge of a place, and you're knitting together the activities to create a sense of place.
Mm-hmm. But I like that you brought up the idea of fun, that it makes your job a lot more fun. And Mayor Goldsmith, you also note in your book that the people who work in city government will just have a whole lot better day to day if they're allowed to be the thoughtful, creative professionals that they can be, as opposed to being what we think of as bureaucrats in the negative way, if they're forced into this kind of checklist life. So I think there's something kind of profoundly humanizing about this wonky subject of better government.
Yeah, and look, I've been in local government for 30 years. I haven't found a lot of the folks who worked for me who took their jobs because they wanted to make a lot of money, right? It's just not kind of why they signed up. They signed up to help people in their community. Then they get in these jobs where they have no discretion, they can't solve problems, or the definition of performance is to get the pieces of paper on the left side of the desk to the right side of the desk before you go home at night. And it just beats them down, right? And so, and actually there are research studies that show productivity increases when people believe that they're solving a problem in their community. So we have those tools now, and it does make work fun.
Great. So this is the last question, and it's pretty much a softball, so I hope you enjoy answering it. Scott, what's the one thing that you want people to leave this afternoon with? What's the one insight or idea or inspiration that you want people to leave with?
I think when we do this work, we need to be intentional, right? I'm going to cheat and say sort of 1.5 things. And what's really critical is that it's community driven, right? The thing that we become totally obsessed with is how do we build more capacity in the community, right? To drive some of this change, to shape the neighborhoods, how they look, feel, and function, right? And we're leading community leadership empowerment workshops and sort of other things. But I think the assets and resources already exist in the communities. It's just we being government or nonprofits or whatever, need to make sure that we can do our best to amplify and lift up those voices.
Great. Miracle?
Do you have that other slide I had?
Absolutely.
I had two slides. I just want to see the other one.
Can you? It's 2 slides ahead. Yep.
So
and then the next
more.
one. There we go.
Okay. So basically, my one answer is 4, since Scott took 2. So, how do you design government around the user experience of its residents? Right. The same as you'd use a user experience on your app on your iPhone or Android. Government needs to organize itself around the user, not around the bureaucracy. Right. We talked about the problem-solving public servant. Government can act in time, right? There is a reason why red tape is called red tape, and we need red tape when we had pieces of paper to tape up, right? We don't need pieces of paper, and we ought to be able to. When I was, I'm going to exaggerate this story, but when I was deputy mayor of New York, here's how we gave a restaurant license. If you're a small business, you'd borrow money, family and friends, to open your own restaurant. By 18 months later, you'd get your 12th permit that allowed you to finally open your restaurant the day you ran out of money, right? It's just almost perfectly timed. So after, agency 1 passed to agency 2, passed to agency 3, right? So how do you act in time, right? And then how do you create an ecosystem, right? How do you change the procurement system? How do you change the HR system? How do you change the bureaucratic rule system? So if you get those 4 things right, then you generate more trust in government, and that allows you to do the big aspirational things that Brian and Scott have talked about.
So I think the connection is if you can do the easier and more mechanical stuff well, you do have a lot more capacity to invest in what humans have to do and which takes time, which is the larger building trust. So thanks very much, gentlemen. And now we're going to open it up for a few minutes of questions. Yeah, and we've got mics too because we are filming this.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I haven't heard how your public-private partnership work. How much money you expect government to give in, and how much is from private sectors? And when the product, the output is coming up, how much share is belong to the government? In other words, it belong to the general public, and how much it belong to the private company? And for the government share of money output, how many units or affordable housing is going to be built? And then how, with that amount of money, whether that is enough people can move in without the private sector to obstruct or interrupt just by the government share of money. If let's say $100 million put in a pot, and eventually maybe $100 million, is it totally belong to the government or not? So if there's $100 million, you can produce 100 millionaire of taxpayers.
So I think we can, since Deputy Mayor Kenner has left, I think we can elevate this. Well, Deputy Mayor Kenner had to leave.
Anyhow, we have a professor. We can solve
Sure.
the simple arithmetic.
Well, I think we can talk largely about the question of public-private partnerships and transparency and trust. I think that's better suited to the skills of the panel.
Okay, give you one for the example.
I think we're good.
We got the
We're
question.
going to turn
We
it.
understand the question.
I'm from Rockwell.
Yeah.
Rockwell have a PPP.
Right.
And instead of allow the government to have $100 million for
We understand the question. We got the question. We're both going. I'm going to answer the first 6 seconds. Have a seat. We'll give you an answer here, and then Scott's going to answer the last.
In other words, PPP is an extreme fraudulent criminal network that created homelessness.
Let me answer the question. Okay, thanks. So I appreciate the question, and there's obviously possibilities of corruption in P3s. I'm going to do it 2 ways, because I'm going to make you answer the question. One is to say, in these relationships, government needs to set the rules, it needs to control the rules for equity, it needs to have transparency, it needs to understand what it's purchasing, and the public needs to be part of the process. And you can think about plenty of opportunities for public-private partnerships where government hasn't kept control, like how much would it cost to have access to a service? How do you handle fairness and equity? But I think the best way to answer the question is your community land trust, where you're actually trying to own part of the property as well. So I think that may be a more direct answer.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, as we're standing up the community requested, it's called the Douglas Community Land Trust, as in Frederick Douglass. Again, that came from the community. But as we've been standing up this community land trust, it's been the residents who've been driving sort of every single decision, right? And so what do I mean by that? I'll give you 2 examples. One, as we look at what level of AMI, what level of affordability the community wants to focus on, that shouldn't come from me, right? That should make sure that comes from the residents. So we have a group of, it's about 15, sort of 20 folks, the residents in the neighborhood, who told us in no uncertain terms it needs to be affordable for the residents who live there now. So that's 30 to 50% AMI, right? We asked the residents, what should we focus on? Should we focus on rental housing, property ownership, commercial the property, because the CLT can do a lot of different things, and they're helping to drive those decisions. This same group eventually will then matriculate into a board, right? It's into a separate 501c3, a separate nonprofit that will actually, they will own the property. They will own the property underneath. And I think one of the things that is really appealing about the community land trust is long-term affordability, permanent affordability, but it's that community control, I think, that is just as important, if not more so. And there's a tremendous amount of examples of how that can be successful around the country.
Great. Second, so I think we're going to let other folks have a chance to answer questions and or ask their questions. Anyone else have a question? Yeah.
Hi, Matt Hoffman from Enterprise Community Partners. Can you speak to how political jurisdictions will need to change in order for this type of operating system to really be effective? And Scott, you see it, I'm sure, working between wards, how there are competing interests. And even if something like a harmonized operating system is embraced, in Washington, D.C. is so unique, having Maryland, Virginia, D.C., and the federal government as an overlay to that to try and get anything done and change the system. How do you envision our city over the next 10 or 20 years embracing this operating system, but really overcoming those political jurisdictions?
An easier question you want to ask? First, let me recognize the importance of your question and then only barely answer it, honestly. So, when I was elected mayor of Indianapolis, a couple decades before, a guy named Dick Lugar had consolidated the city and county governments, right? So when I became mayor, I had more resources. So if you think about government, there's one level of government is trying to create wealth, and then another is redistribute wealth. And we'll stay out of the politics of how much of each you do, right? So when I became mayor, then there was a pretty large land mass, and the wealth and the poverty were both in the jurisdiction I was mayor of. And I was mayor and county executive, right? Today, we're back to where it was before Dick Lugar consolidated, because wealth has now spilled one area out and poverty is concentrated, right? And so you can't really solve these problems at a geographic level that reinforces the inequities, right? So that's one issue. A second issue is I've been thinking about systems in terms of mobility. How does one manage mobility? Not how does one manage bikes or Ubers or taxis or buses or metro or train subways, but how does one manage mobility, right? How do you get folks to work? How do you manage mobility? Well, that's inherently a regional issue, right? And you have to have kind of a regional operating system in order to do that. The same is true of workforce, right? Because if the jobs are in one location and the like. So the only way I can think about to answer your question is A, to acknowledge its importance, right? And B, to say there needs to be a much stronger regional operating rules. And then C, to say that maybe what you do is you have shared services, right? So here's a series of things that we can agree on that ought to be regionally run, like WMATA or whatever the case may be. And here are the rules for those, and here's the tag. And to some extent, the district and the regions around it have been pretty successful in some of those, right? Water, wastewater, WMATA, and the like. But in the end, you have political fights that I wouldn't predict success for in the long run. And DC is also, you've got the issue of folks who can't afford to live in DC anymore, who spill across the borders to the neighboring communities too, and that's an issue.
Yeah, and I'm going to take a much more sort of local the effort. In a way, we in the district, I think, have it easy in the fact that we're a city, a county, and a state, like all pancaked, right, into one. I was just on the phone with your colleagues from Enterprise on Friday afternoon. We're talking about opportunity zones, which is a whole other sort of conversation. But I think that's actually one huge advantage, and where the district can be a real leader for how do we potentially put guardrails on sort of opportunity funds coming into that it's going to be so much, using that as an example, so much more challenging in a state, right, or in a city that then has to connect, where the governor has established where those opportunity zones are, and cities don't want those, and people aren't sort of talking up and down that sort of vertical structure, right? In a way, we have it much easier. That said, I spend a ton of time down in the Wilson building, right? Making sure, just this afternoon, I was sending email updates to each of the city council members. I meet with them 3 to 4 times a year, right? Or their chief of staff, to make sure that there is that constant communication, and that we're hearing, not only sort of managing up, sideways, whatever direction you want to take, but we're also hearing their input, right? It's critical.
Just 5 seconds. this actually, in some ways, is there's much more cooperation. The average large city in the country today, in most but not all states, is almost at war with its state house, right? I run a program for 40 chiefs of staff in major cities, and if you take out only a couple states, they view their battles are with their state, right? That are preempting, that are mandating, and I think cooperation is probably between city and state is an all-time low, really.
And I would argue that if you do have a set of jurisdictions that have adopted these principles of platform and transparency, it makes it a little easier to work together because you can kind of see what everybody else is. You can see what everybody else is doing. Yes, sir. You have a question, and this. Okay, so you, and then you back here, and then you, and then we're done.
I guess I have a question that kind of piggybacks off of the current comments and that question the last person had in regards to how do we actually manage these new technologies, user experiences, as we are coming into a period in time where we're having companies come that are being more disruptive. There's not necessarily a management inherent in the way that new mobility institutions are coming into an urban space. So like you talked about WMATA, it took 45 years for DC to get dedicated funding. I was there, I know, because I was there when the bill was signed, like last week, right? So we have to, like, how are we really going to be able to put our hands around, from a community perspective, a government perspective, around these new mobility and technology firms that are kind of inhabiting our cities. Also, you mentioned sort of the lack of complexity that DC has in terms of being able to be that city, county,
Only in
state,
comparison
all.
to others. Yeah, it's not that it's not complicated, only in comparison.
We have a larger, sort of a entity that hovers right around us, right? We have our federal government friends that, Bowser in her work that she tries to do is always combating with. And so just getting a sense of how with these new tools and with the inherent issues that we're seeing played out in the tech world 10 years from now, and bringing those communities that are behind 20 years to where we need to be 10 years from now in terms of city government. How do we actually do that? I think I don't know, that's a question I would love to have.
So I'm going to intervene, and we're going to collect the next two questions, and then it's going to be kind of like a buffet of an answer. So Mr. Jordan, and then our friend over here.
So I was reading an email post in the blog, and it said that the equity model, community land trust equity model that you're using with the 11th Street Bridge project is going to come to my community. So I wanted to know, well, so what does that mean? What are we getting, and what does that mean? Because I only saw it in the blog post. No one's ever said to me, this is something that's coming my way.
What is CLT? Okay, cool. And I appreciate the brevity and directness of that question. That is an answerable question, and it is a model for all questions. So with that pressure.
Great. My question was, after everything we discussed today and your personal experiences, is there any element of local governments and governance that you think should not be open, collaborative, and distributed? And if, so what and why?
Got it. Okay. So we have how to deal with disruptive companies and their sometimes not harmonious ways of working in cities, and alongside that with the district's special situation as being home to a federal government that thinks it knows best for residents, but may or may not. We have what is a community land trust, and what are elements of local government that are not best organized in a kind of open, collaborative, distributive governance, if any.
I'll pretend to answer this question, then you can answer that.
Yeah.
Right. I actually heard your question a little differently, and
Then
in an even more complex way, right? Which is, so there's one issue which is how well, we'll just call for simplistic purposes a digital divide, which is how do we get folks to be able to participate when they're either by training, income, experience, they're not familiar with the tools, they can't get access to it. Like, so, a lot of folks have smartphones, but not everybody can afford a data plan, right? So what does that mean? So that's one set of issues. Another set of issues is it's impossible to see the future, right? I do a lot of parking advisory work for governments, right? And if you bought a modern parking system 3 years ago, it's outdated today, right? Because we're not really talking about parking. We're talking about kind of curbside management, and kind of how do we build the infrastructure for autonomous vehicles, and kind of where do the Ubers and Lyfts drop off, and how does that affect the traffic patterns, and what about the biker, and right? I mean, all that stuff. And if you're going to bet on that you could figure out what the problem is 5 years from now, you're not. If you think you can figure it out, you're not good in the first place, right? Because you can't figure it out. So we have to build systems that allow procurement systems to be more agile, that allow us to make changes more quickly. That put to the earlier question, that I can put some of the risk factors on the vendor to say, okay, we expect you to do X, right, and keep it and modernize. So your question is at the heart of a lot of really complicated work to be done today. And I would just say that the way we've done it in the past will never work, right? When I took my job as deputy mayor, I took a 2-year sabbatical from Harvard to be deputy mayor of New York. If I would have started a major procurement the day I took office in New York, it would be finished the day I went back to Harvard, 2 years later, right? And that makes no sense, because that means you're buying technology that's outdated by the time you get the technology. So we just have to change the systems the way they get to work. And to the lady's question in the back, because I don't know how you meant the question, but I would answer in two different ways. One is, so we have a lot of privacy and security issues that are really serious issues. There's one set of issues, like I'm a child protective service worker, and I'm trying to figure out if this child needs to be removed from the home, or whether this family has conditions that can be remediated in the home, right? That obviously, to some extent, you want to find out about that child and the system in which they live. But that's very private information, needs to be held very closely. And so I would put kind of privacy and security rules around those. The other question, you had my favorite impossible question for the day, which is, when do you actually stop listening and start acting, right? Because everybody has an opinion, wants to be heard, but at some point you've got to actually do something. And so I think to some extent, kind of how one designs and curates the conversation, right? When is enough information productive, and when do you move forward? And then you see a lot of these questions now coming up, particularly in New York City, where the council passed an ordinance saying we want more transparency and algorithms about police activities and the like. How do we know where the private company has built this into the black box? So I think that I would say that more transparency is better than not, but there are circumstances where privacy should be more compelling.
I'm going to be really short. This Saturday, we're having a community cookout with all of our Community Land Trust Advisory Committee on the corner of Good Hope and MLK. I have a postcard after this. I'll make sure I get it to you. All of our Community Land Trust Advisory Committee members will be there, and it's an opportunity for residents to just come in. And we've done big panels and film screenings, and they've been all well attended, but this is an opportunity just in a really laid back way to have a much deeper conversation over some food and over some music and over some drink.
You're so much more concise than I am.
Real quick, and thinking with the whole equity plan.
Yeah.
What was that? What is I guess there's an equity development.
So there's a larger, we spent about, I'll answer this very quickly, so I think we're at the end, but we spent about 7-8 months back in 2014, 2015, having these big stakeholder sessions to create strategies to ensure that the residents who are living near the Bridge Park can stay and thrive in place, right? So we have 19 recommendations in workforce development, small business enterprise, housing. It's all up on the website. You can download it. But what I think just as important, and this gets to your chapter, and I've only read the first chapter, so I'm sure the whole book, but making sure that we know what gets measured gets done, right? So in our case, from the beginning, we've been working with senior scholars from the Urban Institute to not only document this work, but set some clear measurable goals for each of our 19 recommendations. And what that can do most importantly is build in a feedback loop. So this is all about piloting things. We're not going to get everything right. We're going to screw some things up, right? But how do we then have that real? We have calls every month to see where are we moving the needle? Where do we need to work even harder? But that also means that I hope that there's some accountability, right? That these are a third party that's coming in to evaluate this work. So.
Great.
Hope
Thank
that answered
you.
your question.
Everyone, I appreciate that you took the time to come here. We do have a few refreshments outside if you would like to stay and mingle and talk to people who have shared concerns about new government or the direction of the District of Columbia. So a round of applause for our remaining panelists. And we hope to see you again at the Aspen Institute.